I'm Aman reporting for WORLDbytes.
We're here in Dalston in East London
to find out what people think about young people from Britain going to fight with ISIS and becoming jihadists.
What do you think has driven young British people to go and fight with ISIS in Iraq and in Syria and commit these barbaric acts?
I think maybe young people don't really feel like they can really identify with anything here in Britain.
I think a lot of young people in Britain generally are very disillusioned with British politics and would like something that is a little bit more idealistic to believe in. And I presume that ISIS seems to be offering that to them. I think democracy does need to be reinvented probably for today's generation, and hasn't been. I don't think people feel the value of being part of a democracy. I think maybe sometimes you actually have to be outside a democracy to value it and to see the freedoms that you do have and the rights that you do have in a democracy.
I think, to be honest with you, by rejecting the British society, I don't think it's a good thing, because the British culture, I should say. Because if you living in a country, you're supposed to adapt to the culture. If you don't want to adapt to the culture, it's better that you leave. Because I'm not from here, I'm from the Caribbean. I feel I don't like the British culture, I will leave and go away. But I will not turn back and fight them. But having said that, they're different to me. They think different. You understand? So they are Muslim, and they believe, well, like Christianity is against Muslim. And I think most Muslims don't like Christianity, while some Christianity don't like Muslim either. So it's a kind of conflicting, it's sometimes some kind of things where our leader, the people who lead us, supposed to educate us more on them things, and they're not telling us the truth. They are not. The government is not telling us the truth. I'm not that educated, to be honest. But sometimes I pick up sense out of things. You don't need rocket science to see what is going on. You understand? You don't need that. When Assad, you remember at the beginning of the conflict, when Assad told the West, we are not fighting a militant, you understand, militant group, we are fighting terrorists. They didn't want to believe that. I even think the same ISIS, the West funded them with weapons.
I remember when I was young, you had the conflict in Vietnam, and we saw that live on television. And it made us very, very angry, and you wanted to do something about it. That didn't go as far as, you know, wanting to go there and actually fight. But I do understand why people want to do that. However, if you take into account the atrocities that are being committed now and what is being done, I mean, I wouldn't say that these people are actually trying to resolve a conflict or to resolve a political or social situation. I think they're sadistic, I think they're psychopaths, and they're simply going there because they can let rip.
Now, the reason they are going to fight with ISIS is because they are being taught wrongly. They are being indoctrinated to hate other people. These are still the preachers of hate that are finding one reason or the other to teach the children or even the people to go out of this place, to go and fight for a war that does not concern them. I believe also that there is nobody that is as busy as you are in this country today, or that is busy as myself, that will have the time to, you know, begin to say, I want to go to wherever you think, to go and fight. Teach people to be busy with their hands. Teach people to be busy with their brains, and in the positive way. Because one, you value what you do. If you value what you do, you value your life. If you do not have any value of outside thing, you cannot value your life. So you have to implement your time into something and then value that thing. Then you will not have the time to say you are going to waste your life somewhere else.
Well, I think what it is really a disaffected youth, really, just cliche things like that. Plus there seems to be this whole glamorization of it, of causes and such like that, and I think it's very shrewd what ISIS are doing in terms of selling it to young people to go over there and do this thing. Plus it's a big marketing boon for them to have British accent guys and women over there doing their terror videos for them, to show that they're an international organisation and there's support within the Western countries for it.
What do you think about the government's response to ISIS?
I feel that the government have got to do something. They can't just sit back and essentially let it happen and almost just watch idly. They've got to take some sort of stance, but whether it's an effective stance or not, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think if you look in the past, the more you try to tighten security and the more that you try and take an authoritarian approach, it backfires. And I think there's a risk of that happening here as well. I mean, certainly with Boris Johnson's statement saying that you're guilty until proven innocent, it's a very, very difficult, it's a tough stance to take. I know he was saying as well that anyone that basically travels to Syria or Iraq should essentially be viewed as, I believe he said they should be viewed as a terrorist, or yeah, guilty until proven innocent. And for someone that, I mean, I've got grandparents in Iraq, I think it's a bit of a ridiculous stance to take. I mean, if I went to visit them, should I then be labelled as being guilty?
I think the government's response is a bit harsh. It's working backwards in ISIS's favour, I think. We should be an example against them and how it should be dealt, not going with their flow, because then we're submitting to them slightly if we think about it. You know, we're being fearful and we're acting fearful when we should be acting strong.
I think there's a general sort of sense of alienation around, which is not just confined to young Muslim youth. I think that you see that in all aspects of society. I think you saw that in the London riots a couple of years ago. Yeah, a small group of young Muslims have decided to sign up for what they see as being an exciting cause, but one which is, I think, ultimately nihilistic.
And what do you think about the government's response to this?
I think the government's response to ISIS is probably going to end up being a greater threat, I think, to Western society than ISIS will be themselves. You would kind of look at the situation and say the West at least should be able to have a bit of moral authority in terms of what it stands for. It should generally be, at least in my conception, an idea of civil liberties, of freedom of speech, of freedom of thought and expression, and the rule of law. Now, what the government seems to be proposing around ISIS is to subvert that, really, is to actually say that if you've gone over to the Middle East for any reason, if we assume that you're guilty, you have to prove to us otherwise. Now that seems to me something that would already be quite alienating. If you were a young Muslim today, you would feel as if you were being held to different standards to the rest of society. You would feel genuinely alienated and targeted. And also, as somebody who wouldn't necessarily be targeted by this myself, I think that's a really depressing and actually quite counterproductive strategy that's going to do. I think it's a really terrifying prospect of trying to subvert the idea of innocence before guilty when faced with this, what is a threat but not a clear and present danger.
Personally, there isn't one reason. There's several ways of looking at it, but a lot of youngsters here, for example, you could say are disillusioned. A lot of people are feeling sort of like alienated, and then with the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which didn't actually have a solution, and they just think basically it's like a tit for tat. So on the one hand, a lot of people sort of like they want something to do to kind of feel to justify themselves, and then they're kind of looking at what the Americans and examples that the Americans and the Brits, for example, have set, and decided to say, well, if they're doing that, we're going to go there and protect their people. So you might have people here that even though they live here, they probably don't feel quite as accepted, even though they're born here. So they want a reason, and one of the reasons is to go and fight for their people who they think are being treated badly.
And what do you think about the government's response to this?
Well, it's another infringement on people's right, because part of the Constitution here has always been innocent until proven guilty. As we're getting desperate to kind of try and find a solution, they're saying stuff like that, coming in very, very hard. And I think a lot of the influence has come from America. Ever since we had the 9/11, they've used this thing, fear, as almost like a way of creating something. So Boris Johnson talking like that, they keep thinking there's a quick solution. And with all these situations, there is no quick solution. You've got to do a lot of stuff here first, get things right here first, and also set examples for people to follow. The examples that have been set, people aren't actually following it because they don't believe in it. This is very much a place where you make a lot of money, but there needs to be good principles.
I think people are dissatisfied, clearly, with their own personal situation, and they feel that they have to believe in something. They obviously, it's motivated by religion, no doubt, and there's politics involved, but it's a very complex system, and I think that personally I'm an atheist, so I find it very abhorrent It's going back to the Dark Ages. It's utterly crazy in this modern world, but if that's what people want to believe in, it's a rejection of the modern world. That's essentially what it is.
So there's ISIS, there's just this big, powerful group that I would say are sort of preying on the people on the outskirts of society. I think that happens a lot with like different, I'm going to use the word like cults. That seems to be a pattern where they take people who feel like they don't belong and they give them a place to belong. But I think what needs to be asked is, why do these people feel on the outskirts of society, and why does that drive them with such anger to go on and commit like really horrific things, and how that happens? So I think the question, we need to be asking is, how in British society are we able to incorporate everyone and keep people, I guess, positive about Western ideals? And I think it's such a challenge. I disagree with a lot of what the government are doing in terms of, I think in response to it, they're focusing on fear and fear tactics.
I think they feel that this is something that gives meaning to their lives, and they think that it gives them a purpose. They may have read somewhere in pamphlets that this was the right thing to do according to their religion, but really they have no idea what the circumstances they're really going into.
Well, let's be honest, if we look at the whole mess of Iraq, I mean, okay, I cannot, again, condone Saddam Hussein. I can't tell you how Saddam Hussein ran his country or didn't run his country. I am aware that, he did some brutal things and it was pretty much a brutal regime. But since we entered Iraq and destabilized that whole region, look where we've ended up now. So I think you have to think very, very carefully about going into a state, that is established state, that has, their democracy, or however they want to call that, or maybe their lack of democracy. But for someone outside to go and intervene, you have to be careful, because it's either that or you plan to stay there forever. And as you can clearly see, we're getting drawn right back into that same region, because now we've got ISIS to fight. Would this have happened had we not gone into Iraq? And let's be honest, why did we go into Iraq in the first place? Once you open up a can of worms, the worms are going to get out. You can't just go into places and do what you feel like with them.
I think they're presuming the worst, especially the Western governments of Europe and the United States. But I think they do it with best intentions, because both the UK and the United States have really good intelligence agencies like the CIA and MI5, MI6, and they're trying to prevent any acts of terrorism repeating against them in those countries. However, I do believe that there are some agendas that they are exploiting by using ISIS as a scapegoat.
Being a young person myself, I think it's probably because of a sense of disengagement. I think there's a lot of young people that are angry, and I guess they're misdirecting that anger, misdirecting that frustration, misdirecting that dissatisfaction, and looking for us, trying to find answers to questions that aren't being answered in our society. And I think that's when they're being misdirected, and maybe that makes them more susceptible to be radicalised, etc., because there's something missing that they're looking for, and maybe they're finding the wrong answers in the wrong things. And I think because there's kind of no challenge to that, people are easily being led.
And what do you think of the response of the government on that?
I think the government's response at the moment is very destructive, and I think that for many reasons, but two main reasons being, firstly, the government, I think, is essentially doing ISIS's work for it in spreading fear, number one, by saying we're going to cut freedoms. They're cutting freedoms. For example, I've heard the proposal that if you travel to the country, you can be arrested or your passport can be taken, and but taken down of thousands of videos, for example. By doing that, you're limiting the freedoms that ISIS is also trying to limit. So you're essentially doing their work for them. And I find that very destructive. I think you're playing to ISIS's tune then, and you're becoming a terrorist because you're limiting the freedoms. And I think secondly, linked to what I've just said about young people and why they might become radicalised, I think the government is being destructive in that it's not counteracting anything. It's saying, okay, ISIS is bad, what you're doing is bad, being radicalised is bad, but it's not saying what is good. So what's good? What should we be doing? What would be a better solution? We're not having the discussions about why Britain's great and why freedom's great. We're saying having no freedom's bad, but we're not counteracting that with anything. We're not giving the positive message, which I think is essentially what could change things and what's the most important thing, to provide that alternative. Okay, yes, we know it's bad, but what is good? And to have that discussion, not just people that are radicalised, but as a society, to have a discussion to establish what we think is good about Britain and what makes Britain essentially, so that that disengagement, that anger, that frustration can stop. I think that's the best way to tackle it.